Hey, I never said I'd immediately be going from the Insane Trilogy to Crash 4. No, actually, I wanted to give a shot to all of the other Crash Bandicoot games that have come out over the years. So, yeah, I played Crash Wrath of Cortex, and it's okay. It's not great. I mean, first of all, you can't play as Coco in every single level, so immediately this is much worse than the Insane Trilogy was. But, more seriously, the game itself is just not, like, super good. Controls-wise, the game is pretty fine. It pretty much controls how you would expect it to. It is a little bit looser than the Insane Trilogy, and so I'm also assuming by extension it's a little bit looser than the original Crash games. But not in any way that makes it difficult to control at all. You very quickly get used to the differences in how the game controls, and you're totally fine, pretty much. I did notice in this game that you cannot do the spinning high jump to go even higher. That does not work in this game. And also I found that there's less recovery at the end of the slide than there is in the Insane Trilogy, so you don't really have to alternate between spinning and sliding to move as quickly as possible before getting the running shoes. You can just slide repeatedly and that works just fine. I also found the ice physics in this game to be a lot better than they were in the Insane Trilogy, which is nice. It doesn't have anything that's like fundamentally wrong or broken or flawed necessarily. It mainly just comes down to the level design of the game. It's just not very strong. The level design is just very, I don't know, plain, very vanilla, very uninteresting. It just doesn't do anything nearly as fun as the original 3 Crash games did. It's also even easier than Crash 3 was, making it essentially a bit of a joke overall as a game. Like, it still, of course, has the traditional Crash hallway-style level design, but in this game, the hallways are so wide that a lot of times you can literally just walk past hazards and enemies and stuff, and it's like, what is this level design? On top of that, it does retain the moveset from Crash 3, so you could still do slide jump, double jumps into tornado spins and just fly past a lot of shit. However, in the case of this game, that's a lot less game-breaking than it was in Crash 3, simply because the level design is so much easier that it's not really necessary a lot of the times to make the game easier because the game's already so easy that it doesn't even really matter. And that actually is another big criticism I would give to Wrath of Cortex, is that just creatively, it's very light in terms of, like, how it tries to expand the Crash Bandicoot series as a sequel to Crash 3. It doesn't really do anything particularly new. It's basically just like a carbon copy of Crash 3 with different level design. That's essentially all Wrath of Cortex is. Like, if you look at the original trilogy of the Crash games, then each one expanded on the Crash games in a different way, adding more moves, more abilities, more types of gameplay, more elements to, like, different types of boxes, and all kinds of shit like that. And this game introduces pretty much nothing new. I mean, like, it has, like, some slightly different abilities you unlock as you play through the game, but essentially it is just Crash 3 again, which I guess, considering that this wasn't made by Naughty Dog and it was a different developer taking over the Crash games, they were probably instructed to just, like, make a Crash Bandicoot game just like the previous Crash Bandicoot games, and they certainly did that. But in making it so just like the previous Crash Bandicoot games, they didn't really continue the path that those previous games were going on. They kind of just stalled and remained in the same place that they were in Crash 3. Right down to the fact that the abilities you unlock when you defeat the bosses are almost entirely the same. Like, you revert back to the Crash 2 moveset at the start of the game, and then after you beat all the bosses, you unlock a lot of the same things again. The double jump, the tornado spin, the fruit bazooka, and in the exact same order for a lot of them too. The only thing new in this game is this sneaking move that lets you walk on nitro boxes, which is a pretty stupid ability in my opinion, and it doesn't really add anything. So yeah, it very much seems like the entire idea with this game was to just be a Crash Bandicoot game on the next generation of consoles, which I guess it does succeed at that, but it's not a particularly great Crash Bandicoot game in my opinion. And not only is the core level design in the main levels not as good as the previous games, but also this game, because it's just like Crash 3, has carried over one of Crash 3's biggest faults, which in my opinion is all of the minigame levels. and a lot of them are carbon copies of minigames that were in the previous games. Like, you have this plane level here that's just like the plane levels that were in Crash 3. You have this, like, rocket propeller thing, which is essentially just like the jetpack from Crash 2. And yeah, there are also some new mini-games introduced in this game, but they're not, like, particularly amazing. I mean, some of them are okay, some of them are pretty fun. Like, there's these minecart sections here that are straight out of Donkey Kong Country, and I think these fit very well and are pretty fun. But then there's also these, like, ball levels where you're inside, like, a hamster ball or something like that, and you have to go through these isometric levels, and, like, they're not horrible, but they're not, like, super good. They're just kind of whatever, and there is quite a few of these kinds of levels, and just lots of the stuff that I did not like in Crash 3 is here once again in full force in Wrath of Cortex, and I would say it's even more of a problem in this game than it was in Crash 3. In particular, the worst levels in the game are these underwater levels. Oh my god. Firstly, though, I actually should say that the normal swimming gameplay here, I think, is actually improved from Crash 3. The controls are much tighter and more responsive here than the swimming controls in Crash 3 were. However, the issue's not the swimming. The issue is when you get in this fucking submarine. Holy fuck, this thing controls so terribly, and the level design in these areas is just so shitty that this is by far the worst gameplay I have played in the entire Crash Bandicoot series out of all the games I've played. Holy fuck, if you've not played this game and not done these levels, you have no idea. There's this one underwater level where you are in this sub for an extremely long period of time, and it is just fucking miserable, dude. And it's really unfortunate because when you're doing the normal Crash gameplay, while the level design isn't anything spectacular, I do still find it relatively fun, and it's just every time you get pulled away from the normal Crash gameplay to do one of these fucking annoying minigame levels that it's just like, ugh. And there's so many of them in this game that it really harms the overall feel of the game. However, one thing that they have added to the game that I actually do like is they have added some alternate forms of gameplay that are still within the normal traditional Crash gameplay. Because while you can't play as her in pretty much every level, Coco is actually playable in this game, and technically this would be her first time being playable in a main series Crash game. And they've done something pretty interesting with how Coco plays, because she essentially functions like Crash 1 Crash. You know, Crash has his slide and the jumps and all the abilities you get from, like, Crash 2 and 3, whereas Coco doesn't have any of that stuff. She just has moving, jumping, and this kick move that she can do, which basically is functionally identical to the spin. And so there are a decent handful of levels in this game where you play the entire level as Coco, and they feel much more akin to Crash 1 levels, and I actually think these are the best levels in the game. These ones are decently fun, and I just like this idea of having the types of Crash gameplay from Crash 1 and also Crash 2 and 3 spread across different characters. That actually works pretty well and is pretty smart. Also, in this one part of this one Coco level, they do actually introduce, like, a new kind of style of gameplay into the Crash series that I think is pretty cool, and I would like to see it used more in the future of the series, where it goes top-down for a small section, which is pretty neat, actually, because, you know, Crash, it has its static camera where you're, like, going down hallways, and then it will change different perspectives for different types of gameplay. You know, you have running forward, running toward the camera away from something, the side-scrolling sections, and then there's this one part here that introduces the idea of top-down gameplay into Crash, and I think this works pretty well, and they never do it again in the game, and it's like, what? Why did you, like, introduce this new type of gameplay for Crash and then just not do anything with it? Bit of a missed opportunity there. I hope to see more stuff like that in the future of the Crash games, because it's pretty cool. But then also you have this thing where you get in, like, a loader thing from the end of Aliens, and this basically is just playing as Crash, but now you're bigger, and you can't spin anymore. You only have the fruit bazooka as your only way to attack enemies, which doesn't really change that much about how you play. I mean, yeah, you don't have access to the slide jump and stuff, but I mean, this isn't really a particularly great way to change up the gameplay, in my opinion, compared to Coco. But it is still like traditional Crash platforming, so I don't hate it in any particular way. I think it's fine enough, it's fun, whatever. It's just not particularly interesting or different than the other gameplay available in the game. Boss fights, they're fine, whatever, pretty in line with the Crash series in general, where they're not particularly great, and the platforming levels are definitely a lot more fun, but they're not, like, horrible or anything. As far as 100% goes, it's pretty much the same stuff that you would expect from the other Crash games. Although, one thing I've noticed is that all the color gems in this game are all on the game's death paths, which is a little bit different than how it was done in the previous games, but, you know, whatever, it's pretty much the same, it's fine. But at the end of all the death paths, once you collect a color gem, then there's like an exit from the level, but of course, in order to properly complete the level, you also have to get the crystal, and so most of the time you're going to end up having to play the level over again. However, I noticed that when you die in the death paths after collecting the gem, you still have it once you respawn back in the normal level, so actually you can kind of cheat the system a little and not have to replay the levels by just doing the death path, getting the gem, and then killing yourself, and then just returning to playing the normal game. And this game doesn't have like the alternate entrances or anything like that, so you can pretty much always get all of the boxes your first time through the level, which is actually pretty nice as far as going for all the gems and stuff goes, because it's not as tedious as it was in the previous Crash games. Not that it was like a super bad problem in those games, but it is kind of smoothed out here a little bit, which I do appreciate. There were very few instances where I had to go back to a previous level in order to collect all the gems that I missed. And similarly to Crash 3, there are 5 extra levels you can unlock by doing the time trials on all the levels, which I did just to get access to those levels, which are just more levels that are pretty much in line with the rest of the game. Once again, I don't really find doing the time trials particularly fun in this game, so I didn't really bother to try to get golds or platinums on everything, cause whatever. Honestly, I didn't even bother to collect all the gems, because there's this one racing level where you're in a Jeep, and the controls on this Jeep are so fucking terrible. I mean, they're totally fine for doing the race and also the one level that it's used in, just like getting to the end is fine, but trying to do this race level and getting all the boxes in it is unimaginably terrible. The controls are beyond loose in such a way that I cannot even begin to describe how miserable it was trying to go for these boxes, and I just gave up and said, fuck it, I'm not doing this. So, yeah, that's Crash Wrath of Cortex as far as the gameplay goes. For the other things about the game, I would say overall it's okay to decent. The music in the game, I think, is pretty good, actually. Generally the same kind of sound that you would expect from the Crash games, and some of it's actually pretty nice. I like some of the music here. Visually, it's not great. This is very much an early, like, GameCube, PS2, Xbox game. It is a bit fugly, especially like in the cutscenes where you get close-ups of these character models and you see just how bad they look. Like, you know you're in trouble when the PS1 models of the original games actually look better than the models in the game on the next generation of consoles. But the environments aren't, like, terrible. They're not great-looking, particularly, but they're okay. They're fine. It's just anytime you get a good look at, like, Crash, and you're just like, why are you so ugly, Crash? One thing I will give the game some pretty decent props for, though, actually, I think, is the story. You know, kind of. I mean, still, Crash stories are basically nothing, so who really cares? But in terms of what this game is trying to do with its little story, I think it generally fits with the Crash Bandicoot series pretty well. Because you gotta think that by the time of Crash 3, and also counting Team Racing, there were a lot of bad guys in the Crash Bandicoot universe at that time. You know, every single game had a whole new cast of villains, for the most part, you know, as different boss fights for you to encounter. But I can see why you wouldn't necessarily want to keep doing that into the 4th game at this point, because then you have, like, how many goddamn villain characters, and it's just kind of a bit, I don't know, turns like Villain of the Wiki or kind of tiring in that kind of way. When you already have so many characters, it's probably better to take more advantage of your existing characters than just keep creating more and more and more. And so the idea for Wrath of Cortex was kind of like, well, what if instead of introducing, a whole bunch of new characters to serve as this game's villains, what if we had one new enemy character that was like the enemy for this game, and we make him out to be like a much bigger deal than any of the villains that Crash has faced before? And then they went with the pretty smart idea, I think, of making that character not just a new villain, but making him essentially what Crash was supposed to be, as far as, the lore and continuity or whatever of Crash Bandicoot. Because in the first Crash game, Crash was created by Cortex to be like his ultimate super weapon. Well, now this game introduces Crunch, who is what Crash was supposed to be, the Bandicoot super soldier that Cortex created. I think that actually fits pretty well within the Crash universe, and I quite like Crunch's character design, actually. I think he looks pretty good. And the fact that Crunch is the enemy that you fight in every single one of the boss fights, it certainly does make him feel like more of a big deal than any of the bosses in the previous Crash games. Though one missed opportunity here is that it doesn't continue immediately off of Crash 3 like all the previous Crash sequels did. All the previous games, they picked up right where the previous game's true ending left off, and this game just doesn't do that. And I also find it very, extremely playing it safe with the cast of villains in this game, minus Crunch and stuff, because, Cortex and all of his cronies are still here in minor roles, where they get reduced to, minor level hazards when before they were boss fights, which is kind of lame. But just the roster of villains in this game is the exact same one that was in Crash 3. It's obviously Cortex, but then all of his minions are Dingodile, Tiny, Engine, and Entropy, which is the exact same lineup that it was in Crash 3. They didn't even bother to, mix and match a couple of the different villains from the previous games. They just went with exactly the same villains that were in Crash 3, because I guess that was the most recent game, and we're just copying Crash 3 with this game, so just use them again. Kind of lame, in my opinion. But then also, on top of that, there is, another layer to Wrath of Cortex's story with the elemental masks, which, again, I think this fits very well into the established universe of Crash Bandicoot, where Cortex and Uka Uka released the 4 elemental masks that were sealed away long ago for nearly destroying the world through natural disasters. And so that, kind of like Crash 3, ends up informing the kind of gimmick of the entire game's aesthetic. Because in Crash 3, we introduced Entropy, a time-traveling character, so that way we could have all the levels of the game be time-travel-focused. And now we have these 4 elemental masks of, obviously fire, wind, water, and earth, and we have a lot of levels that are built around those theming elements. You have, Cortex factories, where they're, breaking down stone to make resources out of. The one plane level has Cortex having a bunch of machines that create tornadoes that are destroying the land. You have these Japanese-themed levels where it's raining and flooding and there's tidal waves going by and everything. And then you have levels taking place on these tropical islands where there's volcanoes erupting and lava flow and all that kind of stuff. It works pretty well and definitely fits in with the aesthetic of Crash Bandicoot, with all the masks and the magic and the elemental stuff. Definitely fits. And then also the boss fights, you're not just fighting Crunch in all of them, but you're fighting Crunch using one of these elemental masks against you. So every time you fight him, he's using different powers granted to him by one of those masks, which I actually do think is a pretty cool idea. And for the last boss fight, you're fighting Crunch and Cortex together, while Crunch is also using all 4 of the elemental masks to attack you at once. The boss fight itself isn't particularly good and doesn't do a great job of realizing that idea, but conceptually I do think it works pretty well. Though a little bit odd is that some of the levels kind of fit this theming with all the different elemental stuff, but then some of them have nothing to do with that at all. There's these medieval castle levels, which what does this have to do with elemental stuff? Absolutely nothing. It's just a random level. I don't exactly know why this is here, but it is, so whatever. And upon completing the game 100%, you unlock the true ending, where it turns out that Crunch was actually being mind-controlled by Cortex, and you end up freeing Crunch, and then he turns into a good guy, which I actually kind of like that, because, like I said, the Crash series had so many villains, and it's nice to have another good guy character, another Bandicoot on the good guy's side. And I could definitely see Crunch adding a good 3-way dynamic between, Crash, who's a bit, manic and weird, and then Coco, who's a little bit more in control cool and mature, and, you know, she's all techie, and then you have Crunch being, like, the brawn of the team. Like, I think that could definitely work. However, I would say that in this game, probably the weakest thing that it's got going on in terms of the story elements is the dialogue. The writing is pretty not very good at all. Crunch, when he's being mind-controlled, he's just like, I'm a bad guy and I'm gonna kill you, Crash, and that's his character. It's really kind of stupid. And the elemental masks, they come up to you kind of like the bosses in the previous game did, and they like try to taunt you a little bit. But they show up a lot more often, and they don't really have anything of value to say because they are incredibly simplistic and one-dimensional, just like elemental-themed bad guys where they just make a bunch of puns about their element, which, I mean, I guess that's kind of in line with the previous Crash games, but I don't know. I felt like it was much more well executed in like Crash 2 and 3 than it is here, because some of the things these masks have to say are such brilliant lines as things like this.
They're gonna have to hang you out to dry when I get through with you.
Hope you brought your sunscreen, 'cause you're gonna burn.
Is there a draft in here?
Yeah, they got some pretty prominent voice actors to play these masks, but these are certainly not very beloved Crash characters that I want to see come back in future games. And I don't think they do, just Crunch does, which I'm totally fine with, because Crunch, I actually think there is something to work there with if you flesh him out a bit. I don't know if that's what they end up doing, but I see potential in him. So yeah, honestly, like, my favorite thing about Wrath of Cortex is just, like, its story concept in terms of what it's trying to do. The actual game itself, it's okay, but it's definitely the worst of the Crash games up to this point, which I guess in that way kind of makes it very true to the original Crash series, because, in my opinion at least, going from 1 to 2 to 3, they just get worse and worse over time with every game. And so Wrath of Cortex here, as the original Crash 4, is continuing that trend, and it's even worse than Crash 3 was. But I wouldn't say it's a terrible game. I still had a decent amount of fun playing it. It's okay. However, I did not stop at just playing Wrath of Cortex. I also decided to give the GBA Crash games a try, cause why not? Particularly the thing that had me interested with them is that they were created by Vicarious Visions, which is the same developer that did the Crash N-Tranced trilogy, and they of course did a great job on that, and I figured, hey, if they were trusted to remake the original 3 Crash games, then that must mean that they know how to make a Crash game, right? So I decided to check these games out. And to my surprise, they are pretty damn good. I really like the Crash games on GBA. Obviously, they're side-scrollers because 3D is not really very doable on the Game Boy Advance. But that's totally fine and works because the Crash games already have lots of sections where they turn into side-scrollers. So this is just like, hey, what if we had some Crash games that were entirely like that, and then you just get a really good 2D Crash game. And the level design here is pretty solid. It's, in my opinion, a lot better than the level design that was in Wrath of Cortex. Immediately going from Wrath of Cortex to the first GBA game, Huge Adventure, I immediately noticed like a big jump in the quality of the level design. This is way more fun than Wrath of Cortex is immediately. And I had a pretty damn good time playing the Huge Adventure. It's not a particularly original Crash game. Pretty much all of the elements from the game in terms of the enemies and the hazards and the level themes and gimmicks, they're all taken straight from the original Crash games and just turned into this 2D pixel art style, but I'm not really too bothered by that. It kind of ends up turning into a, like, mix and match of elements from all 3 of the original Crash games, and, you know, they take those familiar elements and remix them into new level design that works pretty well. And this game is also kind of trying to build upon Crash 3 in terms of, like, you get the same moveset throughout the game. You know, you start with the slide jump and all that, and then you eventually get the double jump and tornado spin. However, I found that it was far less overpowered in this game than it was in the original Crash games. Part of that, I think, is due to the GBA's much smaller screen space, and so you don't have as much visibility. So if you try to, like, do a slide double jump and then tornado spin in order to skip stuff, you're not really gonna have any idea where the hell you're going most of the time, and you're probably gonna end up killing yourself trying to do that. So I found it a lot less viable unless I was replaying a level that I already kind of learned the layout for. And also, I found this game to be far more difficult than Crash 3 was, in a very good way. I found this game to actually be kind of challenging at points. I would say difficulty-wise, it's pretty close generally to like Crash 2, or actually maybe a little bit in between them, especially in the earlier parts of the game before you unlock the double jump and tornado spin. While you do still have the slide jump, it's not as useful as it was in Crash 2 or 3, because for whatever reason, I don't know if this was intentional or not, you cannot jump out of the air when you slide. So you can't get as far of jumps as you could in those games, which actually makes the level design a lot more controlled than those games. And so I found myself having to do a lot more like traditional Crash 1 style platforming, just relying on normal jumps to get through things and the occasional high jump here and there. And I found that really fun. I actually gotta say, I kinda like this game even more than Crash 2. The controls are tight and responsive, and it feels really good all around. Unfortunately, it does still have a number of those minigame type levels that I really don't like in these Crash games. I'm really starting to resent Crash 3 a little bit, as it put that plague of gotta have a bunch of minigame levels into the Crash series when it wasn't really there before. The minigame levels in this game aren't, like, terrible. They're fine for the most part, but I'd really kind of just prefer these not be here. And then as far as doing all the extra stuff, it's very much in line with the previous Crash games. Get all the gems by destroying all the boxes, yada yada. Collecting the color gems this time around, they are found in like hidden areas in the normal levels, and then with them you also do gem paths in certain levels. And then of course there are also the time trials, which actually for this game, I did actually bother to get all the gold relics to unlock the final level in the game, which is basically just one kind of like boss fight level sort of, where you're running away from this monster that's an amalgamation of a bunch of different Crash villains all fused together from like a transporter accident or whatever. And it's a fine final level, whatever. It's not really exactly worth the work you put in to unlock it, but it's okay, whatever. As far as music goes, it's not terrible by GBA standards. You know, of course, GBA games don't sound particularly good most of the time, but, you know, they did the best with what they could, and I think there's some catchy music in here. And visually, I think the game looks really, really good for a GBA game, and I particularly like how they went with the visual style of, like, 3D models rendered into 2D sprites, because that's how the visuals are done in Donkey Kong Country, which was a direct inspiration for Crash Bandicoot, and so it feels perfect that once Crash is going down to a weaker machine that has to do a 2D side-scrolling pixel art style game, it makes perfect sense that they would try to mimic Donkey Kong Country's visual style, and I think it works really well, and I think the game looks really good. Story-wise, this game basically doesn't have a story at all. There's like nothing here. At the beginning of the game, Cortex shrinks the planet to a tiny size, and then he like has it, and then go. That's the game. It has no bearing whatsoever on like anything that happens in the game. There's no like level themes or gimmicks that are based around this concept at all. It's just randomly reusing things from previous games, and basically nothing happens by the end. It's just, we stopped Cortex and saved the world. The end. It is the most nothing story that you could possibly have in a video game, pretty much. And also one thing that I find interesting is that Crunch is nowhere to be seen in this game, so I'm gonna assume that this game probably started its development before Wrath of Cortex was out, and so Vicarious Visions was looking at this as a sequel to Crash 3, essentially, thus Crunch is nowhere to be seen. So for all you people out there that really give a shit about the Crash Bandicoot timeline and continuity, I guess technically you could say that Huge Adventure takes place before Wrath of Cortex. And the only reason I really point that out is that once we get to the second GBA game, N-Tranced, Crunch is actually here. And as you can tell just looking at the game, it's basically the exact same thing as the first GBA game. And can I just say I find it incredibly weird that they named this game Crash Bandicoot 2 N-Tranced, because this isn't Crash Bandicoot 2. I mean, I guess it's the second GBA game, but like, Crash the Huge Adventure wasn't Crash Bandicoot 1. It's very bizarre. I think they would have been better off just not having the 2 there and just calling it Crash Bandicoot N-Tranced, but whatever. Yeah, it's basically the exact same thing that the previous game was, just taking elements and level assets and concepts and stuff from the original Crash trilogy and turning it into a 2D side-scroller, and it, just like the first game, is done pretty well. However, surprisingly, this game actually dares to go beyond Crash 3, because similarly to previous games, once you defeat bosses, you unlock new moves. But actually, in this case, you actually get some new moves that are actually kind of cool for the first time since Crash 3. You do still eventually unlock the Tornado Spin, which, whatever. But two of the new moves that you get in this game is the Super Slide, which just makes you slide incredibly far and super duper fast. And this is really cool. As a player who just inherently likes to try to push myself in games and try to go fast, I really like this mechanic, but honestly, it's a bit too unruly. Like, you go way too fast for how little screen real estate you have to see. It is very easy to just slide right off the edge or into enemies and hazards and shit, like, all the time with this. But I do think it is a very, very fun and cool mechanic, and I would love to see speedruns of this game, because I bet you they take really, really good use of this to do all kinds of cool shit. And then the other new move that you get in this game is this super high jump, which similarly is pretty interesting. You can't move very much horizontally when doing this, but the height you get, you know, it's pretty neat. It has some unique applications. I actually kind of like it. It's almost kind of like the spinning high double jump, but actually a little bit more balanced in this game. Which, by the way, you just have the double jump right off the bat from this game, which is a little bit different than previous games, but, you know, whatever. You usually get it pretty quickly. But actually, despite this new stuff that's pretty cool in this game, I actually like this game significantly less than I do the first GBA Crash game. I think this game has a couple of issues. Firstly would be the level design. The level design in this game is pretty damn tough, actually, to be honest. This is the hardest Crash game I've played up to this point, in my opinion. Like, I died in this game way, way more than I did even playing Crash 1. And it's not that the difficulty is the problem, necessarily. I like hard games. I'm totally down for that. But the way it achieves its difficulty is through a lot of, like, unclear and not super fair level design a lot of the time, in ways that I really don't like. For example, you have these ropes here introduced in this game where you can jump from rope to rope, and it's like, okay, that's fine, and you know, you hold on to the rope for long enough, and eventually you're gonna slide down it. No problem, totally got it, it works perfectly fine, but then you get to sections here where there's like nitro boxes on the ropes, and you have to very precisely jump in between the ropes, and it's like, holy shit, you really don't have space to jump in between these ropes. And then you just throw yourself at this multiple times, dying over and over and over, until you eventually somehow realize that if you spin while on one of these ropes, then you can, like, magically steer yourself in the air without falling to move completely horizontally from rope to rope. And it's like, nothing in the game told me that was a thing. How the fuck was I supposed to assume that's how that worked? That's just so bizarre and illogical that it took me until getting stuck at this point to figure out this was a mechanic, because the game never tells you. There's also these parts where you, like, get on a flying carpet, and then you can, like, shoot projectiles in an auto-scroller, and these sections just control like shit, and the level design in them I just find very frustrating, because you have to shoot things out of your way in order to progress, but the projectile you shoot doesn't come out of, like, the middle of your hitbox, it comes out of, like, the top, out of, like, Crash's head, which is just incredibly weird, and it makes it so you have to, like, slightly get below things in order to shoot them, but then because of the really awkward controls, sometimes you don't really have time to readjust and line it up properly, and then you end up colliding into a wall or whatever and dying. It was just really, really not fun, and I did not enjoy these parts at all, and they usually go on for a fairly long amount of time. And also, I ran into this control issue in this game that I really did not like, which is that when you land from a jump, if you're neutral and Crash is doing that landing animation, then if you try to crouch, you can't do it. Crash will just automatically go into a slide. Normally in the Crash games, if you're moving and you press the button, then you'll slide, but if you're standing still, Crash will crouch. And that's also the case in this game, but specifically when you're doing this landing animation, even though you're staying still, Crash is going to slide, and this killed me so many times where there were, like, moving platforms where I had to jump on a moving platform and then crouch under something to avoid getting hit, and Crash would just slide off to his death. And so it turned into a thing where I had to, like, cancel the landing animation by taking a micro step and then stopping and then hitting the button to get him to crouch, but then that took too long and I ended up getting killed, and I had to realize that if you hold down in the game, then that will make Crash crouch no matter what. And it's like, that was just not really something that I was trained to be used to in Crash games, because down never did that before, because, you know, the main Crash games are 3D games. And it's also just like, why? What is the point of having it be that the landing animation plus the crouch button makes you slide, rather than just being able to crouch from that position? It just doesn't make any sense. It just makes the controls stupid. And there were just lots of little tiny things like this that I ran into repeatedly in this game. Like hanging onto these bars I also found was pretty awkward, and I would accidentally let go of them when I didn't want to a number of times. There were just a lot of things in this game that I just felt like, things are just not working the way they're supposed to, which is unfortunate because the level design generally, for the most part, is fine. It's just these weird little things that kept cropping up that kind of ruined the experience a little bit. And also, just to double check, I went back to the first Crash GBA game and I found that it did not have these problems. If you go to Huge Adventure and you land and Crash is doing that landing animation and you try to crouch, he crouches. Like he should. Like, what the fuck did they do in the second game where they fucked up the controls like this? Just leave them how they were in the first game. They were perfect there, and then, what happened? So, yeah, my thoughts on Crash 2 for the GBA are very, like, mixed. Like, in general, the game is fine and fun, like the previous Crash GBA game, but there's just so many little issues that kept on getting in the way and kind of blah. And then on top of the core gameplay having issues, this game also has way, way more mini-game levels than the Crash 1 on GBA had, and I'm just really fucking sick of this shit at this point. Even if some of these minigame levels can be fun, they are never even remotely close to as fun as the core Crash gameplay. This is the issue I have with having games that try to have a lot of variety, is it's just like, I don't want variety. I'm playing Crash Bandicoot because I enjoy the gameplay of Crash Bandicoot. I don't want to do these fucking surfing levels because they aren't as fun as playing Crash Bandicoot. And then, as far as completion in this game goes, it's very, very strange. It's very different than how it was in any of the previous games, despite having a lot of the same stuff. You know, it's got the gems, the colored gems, the relics, but these things are not used for completion in the same way in this game. Gems and relics, to my knowledge, don't actually unlock you anything. To get the true ending in the final levels of the game, you just need to get the colored gems, so bothering to collect all the boxes on every level and do all the time trials is entirely optional. I mean, it's optional normally anyway, but, you know, if you want to complete the game and do all the extra levels and stuff, you would have to do those things. Here, you don't have to bother with that shit at all, which I appreciate that as far as the relics go, because I don't particularly like that in these Crash games, but it's very strange that collecting all the boxes gets you nothing in this game. I mean, it does still get you gems, but gems don't get you anything once you get all of them. At least I think that's the case. I'm not 100% sure. I didn't, look it up or anything, but all I needed to unlock the final levels and beat the last boss was to get all the color gems, which they've made collecting the color gems pretty cool in this game, at least to kind of compensate for this. Because similarly to the first GBA game, you find the gems hidden around in secret areas in the main levels, but now the gems are split into multiple pieces, and so you have to collect multiple colored gem shards in order to complete the colored gem. And once you get all 3 colored gems, there's only 3 in this game, you unlock the 3 extra levels that they offer, and completing those 3 levels will get you the last boss fight. And this color gem stuff is all totally fine and pretty cool. I just find it very weird that you don't need the clear gems at all, so I didn't even really bother to go for all the gems in this game. I still went out of my way to try to collect all the boxes in the levels that I could, but if I missed a level and didn't have a couple of boxes, I didn't really bother to go back and do it. Very, very strange that they decided to make the normal gems totally worthless in this game when that's not how it's been done in any of the previous Crash games, but it is what it is, I guess. Now, one thing I do like a lot about this game over the first Crash game on GBA is that while the first game had, nothing for its story, this game actually does attempt to have a story in line with the console Crash games, and I think it does a pretty damn good job of having something that feels very in line with the previous Crash games in terms of tone and the amount of story here and what it's trying to do. First of all, Cortex is not in this game. He is not the villain this time around, which is, an interesting little change-up for once, not having Cortex around. This time, the main villain of the game is Entropy, which I think is actually a pretty cool choice because he was underutilized in Crash 3, and so now here's a chance for Entropy to really become the big bad that he kind of didn't get to be in Crash 3, despite them making him out to be a big deal. And for the bosses, we don't actually end up fighting the typical roster of previous Crash bosses. No, this time around, Entropy recruits a new Crash villain to the scene, N-Tranced, and his whole thing is hypnosis, and this creates for a pretty fun idea that I quite like, where N-Tranced kidnaps Crash's friends and hypnotizes them and turns them into the villains of the game. So instead of, like always, you end up fighting, you know, Cortex and his scientists and his monster creations and stuff, this time the bosses are Crunch, Coco, and actually fake Crash, who has also been hypnotized, and every time you defeat one of your friends, then you break them free of their hypnosis, and then in the case of Crunch and Coco, they actually become playable, which I think is pretty cool. Unfortunately, they're only used for the minigame levels, but still, I like the idea of having this group of Bandicoot good guys all working together to stop the bad guys. I'm a big fan of that. And actually, not only is Crunch in this game, but there are a number of elements from Wrath of Cortex also introduced into this game as well. For example, the, propeller copter thing is back, and also the Crunch levels that you play are him in the little ball thing, similar to the levels from Wrath of Cortex. Although these levels aren't as good as the ones that were actually in Wrath of Cortex, so they're not great, but still I like that we are trying to build on top of that game, because I liked some of the ideas that were there and what it was doing. And I like that they bring fake Crash into this, because, you know, he was like an Easter egg joke kind of thing in the previous Crash games, and now here he is being a boss fight, where he, mimics everything you do. Pretty fun concept for a boss, I like it. And then you fight N-Tranced as the second to last boss fight, and then Entropy for the final boss once you get all the colored gems. Unfortunately, the final boss against Entropy kinda sucks hard, but what are you gonna do? And then, interestingly, the game ends with Uka Uka being like, alright, that's it, no more minions, I'm gonna fucking do this myself next time, alluding to the idea that maybe Vicarious Visions was planning to do a third Crash GBA game where they were gonna continue this, but that never ended up happening, so I don't think this tease here ever ends up becoming anything in future games. Unfortunate, because I think Uka Uka is another character that's been underutilized, and I would have liked to see him be the ultimate big bad in a Crash game. But, you know, what are you gonna do? So yeah, as far as these three Crash games go, I would say overall they're pretty good, especially the first game on GBA. I really like that one a lot. I think it's right up there with the original trilogy. Wrath of Cortex and N-Tranced aren't as good. They both have a lot of problems, but I wouldn't say they're terrible games. They can still be pretty fun. You just have to put up with some boredom in the case of Wrath of Cortex and some problems in the case of N-Tranced. But I wouldn't say that they ruin the Crash series or anything like that. And I haven't played it since I was a kid, but I recall Nitro Kart being a pretty good and faithful sequel to Crash Team Racing. So I would say at least in these early days of post-Naughty Dog Crash games, they did a fairly good job of, continuing the spirit of the original Crash games. However, going forward, I would argue that is not really the case anymore. And I'm just going to say right here that I'm not going to be covering any of the other Crash games up until Crash 4, because quite frankly, especially looking at Crash Twinsanity and those mutant Crash games, they're not even really Crash anymore. The game design is completely changed to be something entirely different from the core gameplay design and structure of what these original Crash games were going for. And I'm not really very interested in them, to be honest. I looked at Crash Twinsanity, and it looks very bad, in my opinion. And I had Crash of the Titans back in the day on the Wii, and I didn't think it was particularly good. It was kind of just bleh. And same thing for Crash Tag Team Racing. It's nothing like the other Crash racing games, and I'm not really interested in giving it another shot or whatever, so blah, 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 blah. As far as story stuff goes, I think Crash Twinsanity is the biggest pile of trash I've ever seen in my life. Those fucking evil twins characters are so stupid. So personally, I would say that it's Twinsanity and on, where the Crash series really went off the rails. But hopefully Crash 4 gets things back on track, so I will see y'all next time when I talk about Crash 4. Thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed. I'll see you then.